Genetic testing in Canada versus Australia.
So my name's Emma. I'm one of the assistant egg donor coordinators with Her Helping Habit. So I help with connecting egg donors to potential parents and making those matches and doing intake as well, and then helping to guide everyone through those journeys together and making sure that there is a successful, positive experience for everyone involved. And then outside of that, my background, I'm trained in genetics, so I have my master's in genetic counselling.
So how does the role of a genetic counsellor differ between Australia and Canada?
Yeah, so genetic counselling, I'd say between Canada and Australia is quite similar. We have a lot of similarities in terms of our healthcare policies and legalities and things like that. Genetic counselling in Australia, I think, has a little bit more of an emphasis on the kind of counselling and psychosocial side. Not that it's missing in Canada, but if we look at the States, for example, they have quite a larger emphasis on kind of the science and medical side. And the counselling is also in there, but it's a little bit less of a focus, whereas Australia kind of swings the other way, and Canada kind of sits in this middle ground where I think there's a bit more of the focus on the medical side, but still has a lot of the counselling. So things like just in seeing the way that, most appointments are kind of structured, and even the time of appointments and things like that, differs a little bit between countries, just those little nuanced differences. But overall, when we're looking at the role itself, it's pretty similar in terms of what we're doing.
Okay, cool. That's a good answer. Can you describe any notable differences in the actual healthcare systems in the two countries and how they kind of impact on genetic counselling?
Yeah, so I think probably the biggest one, so the Australian healthcare system follows both a public and a private healthcare system. So everyone has Medicare, which is basically like a public system for everyone. And then a lot of people also have private healthcare that they pay into. And so it's basically, I believe, like a monthly or annual fee that you're paying for yourself and your family. And that allows you to choose your own medical professionals, choose where you want to go. A lot of medical professionals and hospitals will offer both private and public healthcare. So it's kind of like an inclusive system, but if you can afford it, you can pay for faster service and more specific service in terms of where you want to go. Whereas Canada, we're mostly just based in public healthcare. There is a private sector as well, but I don't think it is as widely used. And there's also, I believe, some legalities to do with medical professionals not being allowed to be involved in both public and private at the same time, but I don't know a ton of detail on that. So I think in terms of genetic testing, I think, having the public-private split has benefits. If you can afford it, you can get through lines a lot quicker, you can see people a lot faster. The wait times to see a genetic counselor, for example, if you were to go here in Vancouver to the medical genetics and it's not something that's urgent, it's probably going to be like a year to 2 years. So really long wait times, and so that private sector kind of allows people to skip through it. You could also argue on the opposite side that it's not very equitable because people who can't afford it, it's too bad. So, pros and cons. But yeah, I think maybe that's kind of the biggest difference there. A lot of genetic testing in general is, unless you have a specific reason, if there is like a condition in your family, or let's say you're pregnant and there's been like an abnormality shown, things like that, anything beyond those is seen a lot in private companies anyways, because there is this hugely growing private sector of genetics where people want to know their personal health history and they'll pay to have this all done. and that's accessible usually from any country.
Are there any specific genetic conditions that are more prevalent in one country versus the other?
I would say it depends. It's hard to look at the countries of Australia versus Canada because beyond a couple hundred years ago, like most of our genetics are based in our ethnicities coming from other places. So if we're looking at, most people in Australia are based of white European descent, a lot of people in Canada as well, and so the conditions that we see are pretty similar because it's just the same ethnic background that people are coming from. If you start to look at, so I guess the better question is looking at people from, looking at communities and backgrounds from like further back. And so, in Canada there might be a higher prevalence of a particular condition, but it's probably because it's, in people who are more likely to be in people who are from Asia, for example. There's also like some very small communities that exist that have their own specific conditions that are highly associated. So there is some communities in Quebec, and you can look at like Ashkenazi Jewish people, which there was quite a large population in Canada, for Indigenous people as well, where we see these pockets of communities that have higher prevalence of certain conditions in them, and so that might be different between the countries.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I'm sure it would be more diverse, if you looked at like countries that are just from different areas of the globe kind of thing. Like,
so usually like when you're speaking with patients anyway and we're collecting like a family history, we'll ask, okay, where is your background from? And if someone's like, well, I'm Canadian, we'll be like, okay, well, can you go a little bit further back and like, where were your grandparents from, or your great-grandparents? Because Canada is such a mishmash of everything that we don't really have like a distinct Canadian genetic code, whereas, if we go back and then piece people out, okay, I'm of Mediterranean descent, or, I'm of like Eastern African descent, then we start seeing bigger differences.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Can you describe any differences in the two countries' policies and regulations related to genetic counselling and testing?
Yeah, so again, I think when it comes to like a lot of policies are developing kind of based on, big ethical questions. And so what is, we have this technology, how can we use it? Like, what do we define as right or wrong? And I think in that way, again, Australia and Canada are very similar countries in kind of the moral codes that we follow. So a lot of that's similar. There are some different projects kind of going on. There's a really cool initiative in Australia. It's like a hugely funded nationwide study that they're trying to implement reproductive genetic carrier screening as a Medicare-funded item. And so basically allowing any couples who are thinking of having a child to have their carrier screening funded, which is really cool that they're doing that, because as of right now, I know Canada doesn't fund that, and Australia doesn't, but they're hoping to get it. They're basically doing all this research to prove the importance and to put it in place so that everyone can have access to it. So that would be a neat difference there. I'm trying to think otherwise. I think we just have kind of similar kind of legalities when it comes to things like sex selection, for example. In both countries, it's not legal unless you have a specific reason,
like
a condition.
Females carry this in this family or whatever. Okay, yeah.
There are differences. Like, one of the interesting ones is kind of the differences in egg donation and the idea of like complete altruism in Australia, where it's really hard to find an egg donor because you cannot basically reimburse someone in any way. It has to be like a completely altruistic act. So that's a bit different there. And then they have different laws to do with like the identity of donors, which is really interesting. So all children have basically the right to know who their biological donor would have been. So at age 18, they have like a whole database, and the child can find out, the name of the person.
Can you share a little bit more about that? Like, do you know, how does that registry work?
Yeah, so, okay, this is what I believe. Don't quote me 100% on this, but basically the idea is that we're thinking about autonomy and this principle of beneficence and basically doing well by the child, not just the parents. And so from that, there is this idea that children have the right to know their personal background, and it's important to be able to know our genetics, because what if there is something that could affect us that we want to know about, or even just out of curiosity. It's really important to be able to know where you come from and find who you're biologically related to. And so from that, Australia has established basically legalities where every child has the right to know that. And so I believe that it's through government databases that every donor is in the database and accounted for, and they know who they donated to, and they keep this information so that when the child wants to know, that they can have that information released to them. And for anyone to donate, they basically need to agree to this, so that everyone is on the same page. And I think it's really cool, because it really is about the best interest of the child, and our right to know who we're biologically related to. And so I don't know why Canada doesn't have the same thing. I think maybe it could be just to do with all of this technology and all the things that we can do is progressing really fast, and it's important for policy to keep up with that, but also sometimes it doesn't necessarily keep up as much as it should. And I don't know, I would just guess that there's this issue, but it hasn't been put at the forefront of needing to be solved yet.
Yeah.
But I don't know, to be honest.
Yeah. No, I think the UK has the same thing as Australia, because my friend was looking into egg donation and then was like, I don't know if I want to be on a registry, which is fair enough, but that was something that was then included in her decision making, right? I guess, it's weird that Canada doesn't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's so, with all of this, there's just so much ethics involved in everything, and it's so hard because you're considering the input and well-being and autonomy of the person donating and the person or couple receiving, as well as this unborn child who is going to live their life and be affected. So you kind of have to balance all of those things. So I think really the importance of this is highlighting the unborn child's autonomy and their well-being, which shouldn't be forgotten about.
Yeah. Tell me for a second. So it's interesting because Australia is the only country that has a registry where kids can apply and find out who their donor was. Because if you're adopted, you can apply and get your birth certificate, your original birth certificate with birth mom on that. But if you're donor conceived, there's nothing like that. It says on your birth certificate, mom, dad, so you might never know unless you do a DNA test that your donor conceived. So Australia has a registry similar to the adoption system where you can go and apply and find out, okay, who was my donor, and get access to that information. So it's tricky in the sense because I don't know if you would, how you would know to apply, or maybe you do it by chance, but you would go give them your legal name after 18 and they're going to say, okay, yeah, here's your records of being IVF conceived or not. Whereas anywhere else in the world, that's just kind of foreign hidden information unless you do a DNA test.
Yeah, I'm literally just, maybe it was the agency or something that my friend went through, but she went like and had all the tests done, and then they were like, when the kid is 18, they are going to have access to who you
which
are.
is cool because maybe they were just doing like more informed consent, which we definitely like recommend because people aren't told like you're the way it's portrayed in the media and stuff. It's hush hush. You can donate and close the door and never think about it again. So I like if that's the case with your friend, like the agency would have, I guess, educated her a little bit more thorough because there's no such thing as anonymity now with DNA testing. Like that idea that you can close the door and never look back doesn't exist because you can go and buy a 23andMe test or Ancestry and do these home DNA kits and investigate yourself. So that anonymity isn't possible. So I think it's unfair for agencies like ourselves to be able to tell people like, yeah, you can be anonymous because even if we don't have a registry like that in Canada, which I think would be great to have, at the end of the day, someone can do a deep home DNA test and then you're no longer anonymous. So I think that's maybe the route they were going. If they could have an internal registry like we do here at HHH, but like globally or like legislation-wise, Australia is the only country that has something like that to protect kids conceived through third party.
Okay, so are there any specific resources or tools that are more readily available to genetic counsellors in one country versus the other?
Australia and Canada, genetics in general, the cool thing about it is worldwide. We can share a lot of tools. So things like large genetic databases where you can find, a ton of DNA from people all over the world, and also like information on different genetic variants. You can find, this variant has been seen 4 times, and here's each of those cases and all the information on it. So those kinds of things can be accessed throughout the world, which is really cool. Just in the way that DNA is the same concept everywhere. We use the same math everywhere. I think one thing that is interesting that maybe is a bit different in terms of resources in support is supervision, which basically is I kind of think of it as like counseling for the genetic counselors. So basically being able to meet with other genetic counselors and discuss difficult cases you've had. You can workshop cases, you can talk about ethical dilemmas, you can share if you've had a really challenging case earlier that week that has been sitting poorly with you and you want to talk about that. And so supervision in Australia is something that's mandated. All genetic counselors have to do a certain amount of hours of supervision, which is really cool because it's basically like, here is work time set aside for you to develop and also receive emotional support from other genetic counselors, usually ones who might be in other clinics who, so are your peers, but doesn't have to necessarily be your immediate peers, which is really cool. And in Canada, I know that some clinics implement it and use supervision somewhat, but there's not that same mandated supervision, which I think is really, really important for genetic counselors in general to make sure that we're also getting support because it is an emotionally taxing job. So that's one thing that is a bit different in Australia that I think Canada could work on implementing more. What else? And then a lot of genetic companies, like the big genetic testing companies that are used, tend to be accessible worldwide as well. So, companies like Invitae, for example, Canadian clinics use it, Australian clinics use it. I don't really have anything interesting because they're pretty similar.
It's really good.
Okay.
What advances in IVF genetic testing and counselling are you most excited for about the future?
I think a lot of it's really exciting. I think genetic testing in IVF, I think overall, like, so PGT, like pre-implantation genetic testing, I think will likely become more widespread. It's not only useful for those families who have a specific condition that they're looking to rule out, but it also can be useful for people who are of advanced maternal age, and having a way to hopefully shorten the time and the amount of, or the number of implantations of embryos that you're using, which I think can reduce the emotional burden for people. So the idea of that, if someone is of an older age, usually more of their eggs have abnormal chromosomes, and there's very few configurations of chromosomes that can be viable for pregnancy. And so, if we know ahead of time which embryos will be viable and we're able to implant those, then we can cut directly to those and save someone having to go through this process of implanting an embryo, waiting, being hopeful, being let down again. And so I think that'll be maybe something that's more widespread and help with that emotional burden. I think testing for those specific conditions really again reduces time and emotional burden for those families who might have had to in the past wait until much later in pregnancy to make these decisions. So I think that will be really huge. And then I also think increasing the use of reproductive genetic carrier screening will hopefully increase, and I think that as well, is something that could be really important and really useful for couples. If there's a condition where it's going to have a really heartbreaking and severe outcome, and maybe the pregnancy isn't going to carry to term, or you're going to have a child that passes away in the first year or something like that. These are kind of the situations that can be avoided, and kind of the use of this testing for people. I think there's a lot of fear out there when people hear about genetic testing in IVF. They're like, oh my god, designer babies, we're picking everyone to be exactly the way that we are, but that's not what's going on at all. And I think instead it's just important that people know that this testing is being used to, create a hopeful and positive outcome for people and couples and families who are otherwise dealing with some of the worst heartbreak and sadness that you could deal with. So I think there's a lot of really positive things that might be coming.
Thank you for sharing this information with us. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks.